The chandeliers of Ashworth House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light catching on silk and jewels, until the ballroom seemed to swim in liquid gold, and Lady Eleanor Hartwell stood at its periphery like a shadow cast by all that brilliance, her gown a modest creation in last season's dove grey that had belonged to her late aunt, marking her as distinctly apart from the peacock display of London's finest. She had not wished to attend. Her father's illness had worsened, and she would have much preferred the quiet sanctuary of his bedside, with a volume of philosophy to pass the evening hours. But her mother had insisted with that particular desperation of those who fear their daughter's prospects diminishing with each passing season. Eleanor's fingers worried at the spine of a small book she'd tucked into her reticule, a habit that brought her comfort in rooms where conversation felt like navigating a minefield of social conventions she'd never quite mastered, her mind too occupied with Aristotle and Newton to memorize the intricate dance of who might speak to whom and when. She had been standing near the potted palms, half hidden and grateful for it, when the Duke of Thornbury entered with his habitual retinue of admirers. Harrison Blackwell moving through the crowd with the casual cruelty of a man who had never once questioned his right to every space he occupied. Eleanor had heard of him. Naturally, all of London whispered of the Duke's cutting wit and glacial demeanour, how he could destroy a reputation with a single raised eyebrow, how he collected hearts like trophies before discarding them with the same care one might show a wilted boutonniere. Their eyes met across the room quite by accident, her gaze having wandered from her study of the architectural details above, and she saw something flicker in his expression: recognition, perhaps, or more likely disdain at finding someone so plainly out of place among the glittering assembly. He approached with the deliberate grace of a predator who has spotted wounded prey, and Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat, every instinct screaming to flee. But propriety and paralysis kept her rooted to the marble floor as he stopped before her, his perfectly tailored evening clothes making her borrowed gown seem even more shabby by comparison. "Lady Eleanor Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying just far enough that nearby conversations began to hush, heads turning toward the spectacle about to unfold. How refreshing to encounter someone so delightfully unburdened by the tyranny of fashion or social grace. His companions laughed, the sound sharp and cruel, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks as she understood she had become the evening's entertainment. "Tell me," he continued, his eyes cold as winter stone, "do you always attend society events dressed as though you've wandered from a dusty library? Or is this a deliberate attempt to remind us all that intellect and elegance need never coexist? I confess, I've never seen someone clutch a book at a ball as though it might shield them from the horror of human interaction, though I suppose when one has nothing of interest to say, literature makes for a more stimulating companion than one's own conversation." The ballroom had gone utterly silent now, every eye fixed upon her humiliation, and Eleanor felt something break inside her chest, felt tears burning hot behind her eyes, as his words, each one precisely calibrated to wound, confirmed every fear she'd ever harbored about herself, every anxious thought that whispered she did not belong, would never belong, was fundamentally unsuited for this glittering world that seemed to run on rules written in a language she'd never learned to speak. She tried to form a response, her lips parting on words that wouldn't come, and the Duke smiled a terrible, triumphant expression, before turning away as though she'd already ceased to exist, his dismissal more devastating than his mockery. Eleanor fled then, her grey skirts clutched in trembling hands as she pushed through the crowd toward the entrance hall, their whispers following her like hunting dogs, and she did not stop running until she reached her carriage, collapsing against its seat as sobs tore from her throat. The book still clutched against her heart, as though its pages might contain some answer to the question of why cruelty came so easily to beautiful people in beautiful rooms filled with beautiful, terrible light. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The morning after the Ashworth ball arrived grey and cold, matching the desolation that had settled into Eleanor's heart, as she lay in her bed, refusing to rise, her eyes swollen from hours of weeping. Her mother's anxious knocking at the door met only with silence, as Lady Hartwell begged her daughter to receive callers, to show her face, to not let the Duke's cruelty define her future. But Eleanor could not bear the thought of facing anyone, could not endure the pitying glances or worse, the knowing smirks of those who had witnessed her humiliation and would dine out on the story for weeks to come, recounting how the Duke of Thornbury had so thoroughly destroyed that peculiar Hartwell girl who thought books could substitute for beauty or charm. The calling cards piled up in the entrance hall, some genuinely concerned, others merely curious, but Eleanor refused them all, spending her days at her father's bedside where at least her presence served some purpose, reading to him from his favorite volumes, while his breathing grew increasingly labored, his pale hand occasionally squeezing hers as though he understood her pain, even through the fog of his illness. The Duke's words played endlessly in her mind like a horrible symphony she could not silence, each phrase a carefully placed blade that had found its mark with devastating precision, confirming every private fear she'd harbored about her own inadequacy, her fundamental unsuitability for the glittering world into which she'd been born but never truly belonged. She made her decision on the third morning. She would leave London entirely once her father's condition stabilized or reached its inevitable conclusion. She would retreat to their small country estate and live out her days among books and solitude, sparing herself and her family any further mortification. Meanwhile, across London in his magnificent Mayfair residence, Harrison Blackwell sat in his study nursing his second brandy of the morning, trying to recapture the satisfaction he usually felt after delivering a particularly cutting insult, but finding only a strange hollowness that refused to dissipate no matter how much he drank. His sister Charlotte had arrived an hour after he'd returned from the ball, her face flushed with fury as she'd confronted him with a catalogue of Eleanor Hartwell's virtues, how she spent 3 mornings a week teaching reading to children in the East End, how she'd nearly bankrupted herself paying for physicians to attend families who couldn't afford care, how she nursed her dying father with unwavering devotion while maintaining a brilliant correspondence with some of the greatest philosophical minds in Europe, how she possessed more genuine worth in her smallest finger than existed in the entire assembly of that vapid, cruel ballroom. Charlotte's words had struck him with unexpected force, painting a portrait of a woman he'd dismissed as merely awkward and unfashionable, revealing depths of character that made his own existence seem suddenly, terrifyingly shallow. He had built his life on the foundation of his father's teachings, that sentiment was weakness, that compassion was for the inferior, that power lay in the ability to wound without flinching, and he had excelled at this curriculum, becoming exactly the sort of man the old Duke demanded, cold, untouchable, feared. But as Charlotte's accusations hung in the air between them, Harrison felt something crack in the armor he'd so carefully constructed, felt the first unwelcome stirring of what might have been shame, and the sensation was so unfamiliar, so deeply uncomfortable, that he poured another brandy to drown it, even as he knew with sinking certainty that no amount of alcohol would wash away the image of Eleanor's face as she'd fled the ballroom, carrying his cruelty like a wound that would never fully heal. 3 nights after the Ashworth ball, Eleanor's maid Martha came to her chamber with an expression of such bewildered concern that Eleanor immediately feared news of her father's decline, but the elderly woman's words proved far stranger than any medical bulletin could have been. "My lady, the Duke of Thornbury is standing outside our townhouse, and has been there since midnight according to the night watchman, just standing in the rain without moving, without knocking, without any apparent purpose, save to remain beneath your window like some sort of Gothic spectre." Eleanor's first reaction was disbelief, then anger, that he would dare approach her home after what he had done, but when she moved to her window and drew back the curtain just enough to peer into the gaslit street below, she saw him there exactly as Martha had described, a tall, dark figure in evening clothes now soaked through by the steady drizzle, his face turned up toward her window, though she could not discern his expression from this distance, his posture suggesting neither expectation nor demand, but something closer to penitential suffering. She watched him for nearly an hour, her confusion mounting with each minute that passed without change, waiting for him to knock or call out or do something that would make sense of his presence. But he remained motionless as a statue save for the occasional movement of rain-slicked hair across his forehead, and when dawn began to grey the sky, he finally turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the wet cobblestones until the morning traffic swallowed the sound. Eleanor told herself she would not look the following night, that whatever game the Duke was playing deserved no audience, but as midnight approached, she found herself drawn inexorably to her window, and there he stood again in the same spot, this time beneath a clear sky bright with stars, his face tilted upward, as though reading constellations or seeking answers in the vast indifference of space. The third night brought fresh rain, and still he came, and Eleanor felt her anger warring with a confused curiosity that she resented almost as much as his original cruelty. What could he possibly hope to achieve through this bizarre vigil, this silent standing in weather that must be thoroughly miserable, this refusal to approach or explain or even acknowledge whether he knew she watched him from behind her curtains? She considered sending a servant to demand his departure, considered having her mother's footman forcibly remove him, considered writing a scathing note asking what madness possessed a duke to lurk outside respectable homes like a common vagrant. But some instinct she could not name stayed her hand, some whisper of intuition, suggesting that whatever was happening in the rain-dark street below contained a meaning she had not yet grasped. By the fourth night, Eleanor had stopped pretending she would not watch, had instead positioned a chair by her window, and wrapped herself in a shawl as she observed his vigil with the same scholarly attention she might bring to a difficult philosophical text, studying the way he stood with military straightness, despite obvious exhaustion, the way his hands remained at his sides without fidgeting or seeking warmth, the way he seemed to have committed himself to this strange penance, with the same thoroughness he had once applied to her destruction, and she found herself wondering what species of guilt or madness, or perhaps both, could drive a man of his station to such extraordinary lengths, standing night after night in the cold and wet and dark, beneath the window of a woman he had publicly humiliated, asking nothing, saying nothing, simply bearing witness to his own remorse in a language that required no words at all. On the morning of the 8th day, as Eleanor sat with her father reading from Wordsworth while he drifted in and out of fevered sleep, Martha brought a letter on a silver tray, her expression suggesting she knew the sender, though the seal, a simple black wax bearing no family crest, offered no obvious identification, and Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she broke it open to reveal handwriting that was unexpectedly careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the precision of someone accustomed to commanding importance through mere signatures, but now laboring to communicate something far more difficult than orders or social correspondence. The letter began without preamble or flowery greeting, Harrison's words cutting straight to a confession that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. He had spent 7 nights standing beneath her window, not because he expected forgiveness or even acknowledgement, but because he needed her to understand that his cruelty at the Ashworth ball had not been random or thoughtless, but rather a deliberate attack on qualities he had been systematically trained to despise: authenticity in a world of artifice, intelligence in a society that prized beautiful emptiness, compassion in circles where sentiment was weakness to be exploited. He wrote that seeing her at that ball, so genuine in her discomfort, so honestly herself despite the social cost, had terrified him in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. For she represented everything his father had beaten out of him during a childhood, spent learning that kindness was a luxury reserved for fools, and that power resided solely in the ability to wound without conscience or consequence. The letter's middle section detailed his sister's intervention, how Charlotte's catalogue of Eleanor's charitable works and intellectual achievements had held up a mirror to his own spiritual poverty, revealing a man who had mistaken cruelty for strength and isolation for superiority, who had cultivated a reputation for cutting wit while becoming progressively more hollow inside, who had surrounded himself with sycophants and shallow beauties while genuine worth like Eleanor's moved through the world unrecognized by those too blind or too corrupt to see it. Harrison's handwriting grew less controlled in these passages, as though emotion was breaking through practiced reserve, and he confessed that his humiliation of her had been an attempt to destroy what he could not possess. The peace that came from living honestly, the freedom that accompanied self-acceptance, the quiet dignity of a life devoted to meaning rather than appearance. He asked nothing of her, made no requests for audience or forgiveness, but stated simply that he would continue his vigil for as long as it took for her to believe his remorse was genuine rather than performative, that he understood she had no reason to trust the sincerity of a man whose entire existence had been built on surfaces and deceptions, but that he would stand beneath her window every night until the seasons changed and changed again, if necessary, bearing witness to his shame in the only language he had left, the mute testimony of endurance and exposure to elements that cared nothing for titles or consequence. The letter closed with a single sentence that Eleanor read 3 times, her heart performing complicated maneuvers she could not name. "I do not ask you to forgive the Duke of Thornbury, Lady Eleanor, for he deserves no such grace. But perhaps someday you might come to believe that the man who stands in the rain below your window is trying, however inadequately, to become someone worthy of the extraordinary person he so grievously wronged." Weeks passed, and what had begun as Eleanor's reluctant curiosity transformed into something closer to systematic observation, her scholarly mind applying itself to the study of Harrison Blackwell's nightly vigil with the same rigor she might bring to a particularly complex philosophical text, and she found herself noting details that accumulated into a portrait far more complicated than the cruel aristocrat who had shattered her dignity at the Ashworth ball. She watched as autumn's rain gave way to the first frost of winter, observing how he began bringing a book that he would read by the light of a small lantern when the weather permitted, his posture suggesting genuine absorption rather than mere performance. And once she saw the title through her opera glasses, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, which struck her as either calculated symbolism or evidence that his letter's claims of attempting transformation might contain some kernel of truth. On a particularly bitter November night when sleet turned the cobblestones treacherous, she witnessed him help a drunk man who had collapsed nearby, supporting the stranger's weight and walking him 3 streets over to what appeared to be his lodgings, then returning to resume his post as though this interruption had been the natural action of any decent person rather than the extraordinary condescension of a duke towards someone society deemed beneath notice. The stray cats began appearing in the 3rd week of her observation, scrawny creatures that haunted the mews behind the townhouses, and Eleanor watched with growing amazement as Harrison produced small packets of food from his coat pockets, crouching down with infinite patience to coax the wary animals close enough to eat, his movements gentle in ways that contradicted everything she knew about his reputation for cutting coldness and aristocratic disdain. She noticed too the toll the vigil was taking on him, how his face grew gaunt as the weeks accumulated, how his expensive clothing began showing signs of weather damage, despite what must have been daily replacement, how he sometimes swayed slightly in the small hours before dawn, as though exhaustion threatened to topple him, yet he never once knocked on her door or made any gesture that might be construed as demanding acknowledgement or reward for his suffering. Eleanor found her anger beginning to crack like ice under spring sun, not breaking entirely but developing fissures through which complicated emotions seeped confusion at his persistence, unwilling admiration for his endurance, curiosity about what manner of transformation could drive a man to such lengths, and something she refused to name that felt dangerously close to concern when she saw him shivering in the pre-dawn cold. She told herself repeatedly that this was mere observation, that studying his behavior implied nothing about forgiveness or softening, that she was simply trying to understand the psychological mechanism behind his public penance. But in her most honest moments, usually around 3 in the morning, when sleep eluded her and she sat wrapped in blankets by her window, she admitted that she had begun waiting for him, that the sight of his solitary figure had become woven into the fabric of her nights, and that his absence on the single evening he failed to appear due to what she later learned was his sister's wedding, had left her with an unsettled feeling she could not quite categorize as either relief or disappointment, and she wondered with growing unease whether her observation of his vigil was changing her as much as his endurance of it seemed to be changing him. The storm arrived on the 43rd night of Harrison's vigil, announced by afternoon skies that darkened to an ominous green-black and winds that rattled window panes throughout Mayfair, with a violence that sent servants scurrying to secure shutters and bring in anything that might become a projectile in the tempest to come. And Eleanor stood at her window as the first fat drops began to fall, watching the street below and knowing with absolute certainty that he would come despite the weather's fury, despite any rational person seeking shelter from what was clearly going to be one of the season's most violent storms. She told herself she didn't care, that if he was fool enough to stand in a lightning storm, then his fate was his own concern. But even as she formed these thoughts, her eyes remained fixed on the corner where he always appeared, and when his familiar figure materialized through the driving rain at precisely midnight, something tightened in her chest that felt uncomfortably like fear rather than the satisfying vindication she had expected to feel watching him suffer the consequences of his obstinate penance. The lightning began in earnest around 1 o'clock, great jagged strikes that illuminated the street in stark white flashes, and Eleanor could see Harrison clearly in those moments, soaked through completely, his expensive coat plastered to his frame, his hair dripping rivulets down a face set in lines of grim determination, and she watched as he swayed slightly. When thunder cracked so close, the entire house shuddered, watched as he steadied himself and remained rooted to his spot, with a stubbornness that would have been admirable if it weren't so utterly maddening. By 2 o'clock the storm had reached its full fury, rain falling in sheets so thick it seemed impossible to breathe within them, wind howling through the streets with a voice like grief itself, and Eleanor found herself pressed against the window glass, her breath fogging it as she strained to keep him in sight through the deluge. And when the next lightning strike came so bright, it seared her vision. Even through closed eyelids, she saw him stumble, saw his knees begin to buckle, and before her conscious mind could engage in its usual careful deliberation, her body was moving, her feet carrying her away from the window and down the stairs at a run that would have scandalized her in any other circumstance, her hands fumbling with the locks on the front door that she had not touched in 6 weeks, and then she was wrenching it open to the storm's assault, cold rain immediately drenching her nightdress and wrapper, and there he was on the pavement looking up at her with an expression of such profound shock and hope and fear that it stopped her heart mid-beat, and they stood there facing each other for a moment, suspended outside time, both soaked to the bone, both uncertain, the space between them charged with something more dangerous than the lightning crackling overhead, and Eleanor realized with a clarity that felt like its own kind of storm that everything was about to change, that opening this door meant opening something far more consequential than mere wood and iron, that the choice before her in this rain-lashed moment would determine not just this night, but all the nights that followed, and still she stood there, the threshold beneath her feet feeling like the edge of the world itself. Eleanor gestured toward the servants' entrance, with a hand that trembled from cold and something far more complicated than mere temperature. Her voice, when she finally found it emerging smaller than she intended, barely audible above the storm's continued assault. "You should come inside to dry off, not to the main rooms. But the servants' hall has a fire." And she watched as understanding flickered across his face, recognition that this was not forgiveness or even friendship, but simply the basic humanity. One human being might offer another who was in danger of freezing to death on their doorstep, and he nodded once, sharply, before following her around the side of the house, to the modest entrance where scullery maids and footmen came and went, and the warmth of the kitchen hit them both like a physical blow after the storm's bitter cold. They stood awkwardly in that utilitarian space, dripping onto flagstones worn smooth by generations of servants' feet, and Eleanor found a kettle already warm on the stove, and poured tea with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped the cups, and when she finally turned to face him properly in the lamplight, she was struck by how diminished he appeared. This man whose cruel words had once held the power to destroy her, now looking like nothing so much as a penitent stripped of all armor, his expensive clothing ruined, and his face bearing an expression of such naked gratitude for this small mercy that something twisted painfully in her chest. They spoke stiffly at first, Eleanor's words emerging clipped and formal, "You might have been killed by lightning," which would have been foolish beyond measure, and Harrison's response equally careful, "I gave you my word that I would maintain the vigil, and I have never broken my word once given, regardless of circumstance." And then somehow, perhaps because the storm had stripped away pretense, or perhaps because standing in a servant's kitchen at 3 in the morning created a strange intimacy that formal parlors could never achieve, their conversation deepened into territories neither had intended to traverse. Harrison spoke haltingly about his father, about how the old Duke had systematically beaten any softness from him, starting when he was barely old enough to walk, about being locked in cellars for crying, about learning that kindness was weakness and compassion was contemptible, about building walls so high and thick that eventually he forgot there had ever been anything inside them worth protecting, and Eleanor listened with growing horror as he described a childhood that made her own lonely bookishness seem like paradise by comparison. But she refused to let pity soften her entirely, refused to allow his suffering to erase hers. And when he fell silent, she spoke her own truth with a rawness that surprised them both. She told him how his words at the ball had confirmed every terrible thing she believed about herself, every fear that her intelligence made her unlovable, that her awkwardness marked her as unworthy, that her preference for books over balls meant she would never belong anywhere or to anyone. And she watched his face crumple with genuine anguish as she detailed the precise architecture of the pain he had inflicted, how she had replayed his mockery in her mind until it became the soundtrack of her self-loathing. And the honesty between them felt like surgery without anesthetic, necessary and agonizing and somehow oddly purifying, as though the very act of speaking these truths aloud in this humble kitchen began the slow process of lancing wounds that had festered too long in silence. And when Eleanor finally met his eyes across the scarred wooden table, she saw tears streaming down his face, mixing with the rainwater still dripping from his hair. And she realized with a shock that felt like lightning of its own kind, that this moment of painful honesty had created something between them that had not existed before. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but perhaps the fragile foundation upon which either might eventually be built, if they both proved brave enough to continue this terrible, necessary excavation of their mutual wounds. The storm's fury had lessened to a steady rain by the time Eleanor spoke, the words that would reshape both their futures, her voice emerging quiet but steady in the warmth of the servants' kitchen where they had laid bare their wounds. If you truly wish to change, if your vigil represents genuine desire for transformation rather than mere performance of contrition, then I propose an arrangement that will test the sincerity of both your remorse and your resolve. And she watched Harrison's face shift from exhaustion to sudden alertness, his red-rimmed eyes focusing on her with an intensity that might have unsettled her if she hadn't already committed to this unexpected path. She explained her proposal carefully, each word chosen with the precision she normally reserved for her scholarly correspondence. He would continue his nightly vigil as proof of his commitment, but once each week he would be permitted entry to her father's library, where she would undertake his education in the things she knew: literature, philosophy, the genuine human connection that came from engaging with ideas larger than oneself, and the empathy that grew from understanding perspectives beyond one's own narrow experience. And in exchange, he would approach these lessons with complete honesty, reading what she assigned, discussing what moved or troubled or confused him, allowing her to see whether the capacity for change truly existed beneath the armor of cruelty he had worn for so long. Harrison's response came immediately, without the careful deliberation she had expected. "Yes, whatever terms you set, whatever conditions you require, I accept entirely and without reservation." And there was something almost desperate in his eagerness that gave Eleanor pause, made her wonder if perhaps she had miscalculated, if his need for redemption might prove as consuming and ultimately destructive as his previous need for cruel superiority. But she pushed the concern aside because at least this desperation aimed toward growth rather than diminishment, toward building rather than destroying. They settled the practical details with surprising efficiency, given the hour and their mutual exhaustion. Thursday evenings at 8 o'clock, he would arrive at the servants' entrance. They would spend 2 hours in her father's library, which her parent rarely used anymore due to his declining health. Harrison would read assigned materials throughout the week and come prepared to discuss them honestly, and under no circumstances would this arrangement be construed as courtship or reconciliation, but rather as a form of mutual education, she teaching him what compassion and genuine feeling looked like, while he taught her through his efforts. Whether true transformation was possible, or merely another pretty lie society told itself to avoid confronting the permanence of character. As Harrison prepared to leave, returning to the storm that had gentled but not ceased, Eleanor felt compelled to offer one final warning, her hand on the door that would release him back into the rain. "I want you to understand that I am not doing this because I forgive you, because I do not, and I may never, and if at any point I determine that you are performing rather than changing, if I sense that this is merely another manipulation or a game to salve your conscience without doing the actual work of transformation, I will end our arrangement immediately and without explanation." And she watched as he absorbed these harsh terms, watched as something that looked remarkably like relief rather than disappointment crossed his features, and he nodded once before stepping back into the night. And Eleanor stood in the doorway watching his figure disappear into the darkness, wondering what species of madness had possessed her to offer education to the man who had sought to destroy her, yet unable to deny the strange rightness of it, the sense that perhaps in teaching him, she might also learn something essential about the nature of change, about whether the human heart was as fixed and immutable as she had always believed, or whether it possessed some capacity for genuine metamorphosis that her books had hinted at, but her experience had never confirmed. And as she finally closed the door and made her way back through the sleeping house to her room, she felt the weight of what she had set in motion, settling over her shoulders like a cloak whose warmth and burden she would carry into whatever future this arrangement might create. Months passed like the turning of pages in one of Eleanor's beloved books, each Thursday evening adding another layer to their unexpected arrangement, and what had begun as rigid educational sessions, with Eleanor assigning texts and Harrison dutifully reporting his reactions, gradually transformed into something neither had anticipated: genuine intellectual communion, the kind of meeting of minds that Eleanor had only ever experienced in her solitary readings, and that Harrison had never known existed beyond the transactional conversations of society. The transformation revealed itself in small moments. The evening, Harrison arrived with his copy of Wordsworth's poems, marked with careful annotations in his own hand, passages underlined, where the language had struck him with unexpected force. And when Eleanor asked him to read his favorite aloud, his voice broke on the lines about splendor in the grass, glory in the flower. And she watched in astonishment as tears streamed down his face. This man who had been taught that emotion was weakness, now weeping openly over poetry's beauty, and he looked at her with something like wonder and said, "I never knew words could do this, could reach inside and touch places I didn't know existed." And Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, and some final barrier beginning to crumble. She began to see past the armor he had worn for so long to the wounded boy beneath, the child who had learned to survive through cruelty because kindness had been beaten out of him before he was old enough to understand what was being lost. And she found herself wanting not just to teach him, but to show him all the beauty he had missed, all the tenderness the world could offer if one approached it with an open heart rather than a closed fist. Harrison brought her gifts that revealed his growing understanding of what she valued, not jewels or expensive trinkets, but rare first editions he discovered in dusty bookshops, a manuscript of medieval poetry he found at an estate sale, a leather journal with her initials embossed on the cover for her own philosophical writings, and each gift demonstrated that he had been paying attention not just to her words, but to her essence, to the things that made her who she was, rather than who society expected her to be. Eleanor reciprocated by teaching him to see beauty in ordinary moments, pointing out how lamplight transformed her father's library into a cathedral of shadows and gold, how the rain against the windows created rhythms as complex as any symphony, how the simple act of sharing tea and conversation could become a form of communion if approached with genuine presence rather than social obligation. And she watched as Harrison learned to pause, to notice, to allow himself to be moved by small magnificences he had previously dismissed as beneath his attention. Their discussions ranged from philosophy to poetry to the nature of redemption itself, and Eleanor found herself challenged by Harrison's questions, his perspective shaped by suffering, giving him insights into human darkness that her more sheltered experience had not provided. And gradually, she began to realize that she was learning from him even as she taught, that this exchange was becoming genuinely mutual rather than the one-sided transaction she had initially envisioned. Friendship bloomed between them like something inevitable and surprising all at once, growing in the spaces between their weekly meetings, nurtured by the knowledge that he still maintained his vigil every night, still stood beneath her window in rain and cold and the early snows of approaching winter. And Eleanor found herself watching for him, not with anger anymore, but with something dangerously close to anticipation, and sometimes when sleep eluded her, she would stand at her window and simply observe him reading by lamplight. And in those quiet hours she began to understand that the man standing vigil and the man discussing Keats in her father's library were not separate beings, but facets of the same transformed soul, and the realization terrified her, even as it drew her inexorably forward into emotional territory she had sworn never to enter, had promised herself she would guard against, yet found herself helpless to resist as the months accumulated, and their connection deepened into something that could no longer be dismissed as mere educational arrangement or philosophical exercise, but had become something far more dangerous and infinitely more precious than either had intended when they began this strange journey together. The evening arrived clothed in the particular stillness that sometimes descends upon London in deepest winter, when even the city's usual clamour seems muffled by cold and darkness, and Eleanor had selected Shakespeare's sonnets for their lesson with deliberate care, drawn to their exploration of love's complexities and time's relentless passage, though she told herself this choice held no deeper significance than academic interest in poetic form and metaphor. Harrison arrived precisely at 8 as always, but Eleanor noticed something different in his bearing tonight, a tension in his shoulders that spoke of words held back, of confessions building pressure behind the careful walls of their established routine, and when he settled into his customary chair across from her in the lamp-lit sanctuary of her father's library, she saw his hands trembling slightly as he opened his leather-bound volume to the assigned sonnets. They began with Sonnet 116, reading aloud in turns, as was their practice, letting Shakespeare's language fill the space between them with its assertions about love's constancy and refusal to alter when alteration found, and when Eleanor read the lines about love being an ever-fixed mark that looked on tempests and was never shaken, she felt Harrison's gaze upon her with an intensity that made her stumble over the words, made her suddenly aware that they were no longer simply discussing poetry, but circling something far more dangerous and immediate. Harrison's voice, when he read Sonnet 73, carried weight beyond mere recitation, each line about autumn's yellow leaves and twilight's fading, seeming to speak directly to their strange situation, and when he reached the final couplet about love growing stronger in the presence of approaching loss, he closed the book with careful deliberation and looked at Eleanor with eyes that held something she had learned to recognize over these months, but had never allowed herself to name. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, his careful composure cracking to reveal the vulnerability beneath. "About the vigil, about why I truly continue standing beneath your window every night, when by any reasonable measure I have already proven whatever commitment our arrangement required." And Eleanor felt her heart begin to race even as she maintained her outward calm, even as she told herself she was not ready for whatever confession was about to reshape the careful boundaries they had established. Harrison spoke then with the honesty she had demanded from their first tentative arrangement, his words coming slowly as though each one cost him something precious. "It began as penance, yes, as punishment I believed I deserved, and proof of remorse I needed you to witness, but somewhere in those long cold hours it transformed into something else entirely, into the most peaceful part of my existence, and into hours when I could simply be present without performance or pretense, watching your window and knowing that you were safe within, that you were perhaps reading or writing or thinking those profound thoughts you share with me each Thursday, and I realized that those hours of vigil had become not my punishment, but my sanctuary, the only time I felt truly myself, truly at peace with who I was becoming, rather than haunted by who I had been." And Eleanor listened with something like terror blooming in her chest, because she recognized the truth he was speaking, recognized it because she had felt the mirror image of it in her own experience. She found herself confessing before she could stop the words, before caution could silence honesty. "I began watching for you, not to monitor your suffering, but because your presence became a strange comfort, because knowing you were there made me feel less alone in my own vigil of healing and transformation, and sometimes I would wake in the night and go to the window just to see you reading by lamplight, just to observe this man who had hurt me so deeply, now standing guard over my peace with such patient devotion, and I did not know what to do with these feelings, did not know how to reconcile the anger I believed I should maintain with the tenderness I found growing, despite my best efforts to prevent it." And as the words left her lips, she saw Harrison's expression shift from careful and hope to something like wonder, and in that moment they both understood that their arrangement had become something far beyond educational exercise or penance, and had transformed into a connection neither had intended, but both had been helpless to prevent, and the air between them seemed to shimmer with all the words still unspoken, all the feelings acknowledged but not yet named, and Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that they stood balanced on the edge of something that would either destroy them both or transform them into something neither could have imagined when this strange dance first began beneath her. window on that rain-soaked night months ago. The following weeks brought complications that descended upon their fragile understanding, like frost creeping across glass, beautiful in its patterns but capable of shattering everything beneath. For London society had begun to notice what Eleanor and Harrison had been too absorbed in their own transformation to properly conceal the Duke of Thornbury's regular Thursday visits to the Hartwell residence and his nightly vigil that servants whispered about in kitchens and marketplaces, the subtle but unmistakable signs of a connection that defied the social rules governing proper courtship between members of the ton. The rumors spread through drawing rooms and parlors with the inexorable momentum of wildfire, each retelling adding embellishments and speculation until the truth became almost unrecognizable beneath layers of gossip. Some said the Duke had gone mad with guilt and now stalked Lady Eleanor like a penitent ghost. Others whispered that she had ensnared him with her bookish witchcraft. Still others suggested something far more scandalous was occurring during those supposedly educational sessions in her father's library. And Eleanor felt the weight of scrutiny pressing down upon her with suffocating force, just when she had finally begun to imagine a future beyond her humiliation. Her mother, Lady Margaret Hartwell, who had remained largely absent during Eleanor's initial retreat from society, now descended upon her daughter with the full force of maternal concern mixed with social calculation, cornering Eleanor in the morning room one grey afternoon and demanding answers with a directness that left no room for evasion. You must either accept the Duke's suit publicly or reject him entirely and end this spectacle that has half of London gossiping about our family, because this strange arrangement you have maintained cannot continue without destroying what remains of your reputation and any hope you might have of eventually securing a suitable marriage. And Eleanor felt anger flare hot in her chest at the implication that her worth depended entirely upon securing any marriage at all, yet she understood her mother's concern even as she resented the pressure it represented. Harrison faced similar demands from his own family, his younger sister Margaret writing frantic letters, warning him that their father had heard of his obsession with that Hartwell girl and was threatening to travel to London to end the embarrassment personally, while his mother sent carefully worded notes suggesting that if Harrison intended to court someone, he might consider the Pemberton daughter, or perhaps young Lady Catherine, whose family connections and fortune would strengthen the Blackwell legacy rather than complicate it with this peculiar attachment to a woman he had publicly humiliated months earlier. The pressure mounted from all sides like walls closing in, each social engagement Eleanor attended, bringing pointed questions disguised as innocent curiosity. Each gathering Harrison navigated, featuring strategic introductions to eligible young women, whose parents saw an opportunity in the Duke's apparent vulnerability, and both found themselves caught between the genuine connection they had built in the privacy of her father's library and the harsh demands of the society. They had never quite managed to escape despite their best efforts to exist, apart from its judgments. Eleanor lay awake nights wrestling with impossible questions. What did she truly want from Harrison beyond their intellectual communion and the strange comfort of his vigil? Could she risk her heart again after the devastation of his initial cruelty? Did she possess the courage to face society's censure if she chose to pursue whatever was growing between them? And perhaps most terrifying of all, what if the connection that seemed so profound in lamplight and poetry dissolved when exposed to the harsh scrutiny of daylight and social expectation? Harrison felt the weight of expectation differently but no less acutely, knowing that his family's demands carried the implicit threat of disinheritance and social ostracism if he continued down this path, yet finding himself unable to imagine returning to the empty performance of his former life, unable to abandon the nightly vigil that had become his anchor, or the Thursday evenings that had taught him what it meant to truly know another human soul, and he understood with growing clarity that he stood at a crossroads that would define not just his immediate future, but the entire trajectory of the man he was still struggling to become. The old Duke of Thornbury arrived in London on a Tuesday morning like a winter storm descending upon the city, bringing with him the full weight of aristocratic authority and paternal fury that Harrison had spent months attempting to escape through his transformation. And Eleanor learned of his presence not from Harrison, but from her own father, whose face had gone ashen after receiving an unexpected visit from the elder Blackwell at his office in the city, a visit that carried threats wrapped in the polite language of business concerns, but unmistakable in their intent to destroy the Hartwell family's modest commercial interests, if Eleanor did not immediately cease whatever hold she had and established over the younger Duke. Harrison appeared at Eleanor's door that evening, not for their scheduled Thursday meeting but in obvious distress, his careful composure shattered by the confrontation he had endured with his father in the drawing room of the Thornbury London residence, where the old Duke had made his position brutally clear. End this embarrassment with the Hartwell girl, court someone appropriate to the family name, or be cut off entirely from the inheritance and position that had been prepared for him since birth. Stripped of everything except the title itself, which could not be legally removed, but rendered meaningless without the wealth and influence that gave it power. Eleanor received him in the library where they had shared so many transformative evenings, but tonight the familiar space felt charged with a different energy, heavy with the weight of impossible choices and consequences that extended far beyond just the two of them, touching her father's livelihood and Harrison's entire future, and she saw in his eyes the agony of a man being torn between two versions of himself: the dutiful son, shaped by generations of Blackwell expectation, and the authentic person he had been struggling so desperately to become through their months of connection and growth. Harrison spoke with a rawness that stripped away all pretense. "He has threatened your father's business, Eleanor. He threatened to use every connection and influence the Blackwell name commands to ensure that no one in London will trade with him, that every contract will dissolve and every partnership will crumble, and he will do it not because he cares about propriety or family honor, but because he cannot bear that I have chosen something for myself rather than accepting what he has decreed, because my transformation represents a rejection of everything he tried to beat into me as a child. Every lesson about power and cruelty and emotional detachment that he insisted would make me strong." And Eleanor felt her heart break, not just for herself, but for this man who had worked so hard to become better than his upbringing, who now faced losing everything he had built through genuine effort and painful honesty. She wanted to tell him to choose his inheritance, to protect himself and his future, wanted to be noble and self-sacrificing and release him from whatever obligation he felt toward her, but the words would not come because she knew with devastating clarity that if Harrison returned to his father's control, if he abandoned this path of transformation to become again the cold, cruel man society expected, it would destroy not just their connection, but the very soul he had been fighting to reclaim, and she could not bear to be the reason for that destruction, even if it meant watching her own father suffer the consequences of the old Duke's vindictive power. Harrison looked at her across the library that had become their sanctuary and asked the question that would define everything that followed. "What would you have me choose, Eleanor? Because I find I cannot make this decision alone, cannot weigh my inheritance against everything you have taught me about authenticity and courage and living according to conscience rather than convenience, and I need you to tell me honestly whether you believe what we have built together is worth the cost it will demand from both our families." And Eleanor understood that he was not asking her to make the choice for him, but rather inviting her to witness the choice he had already made in his heart, the choice that terrified him precisely because it represented a complete severance from everything familiar and safe, a leap into unknown territory with no guarantee of anything except the integrity of following his transformed conscience rather than his father's commands. And she took his hands in hers and spoke with a conviction that surprised them both, telling him that she could not make this decision for him, but that whatever he chose, she would understand, that their connection had already given her more than she had believed possible after her humiliation, that he owed her nothing except continued honesty about who he was and what he truly wanted from his one precious life. And in that moment of complete vulnerability and mutual recognition, they both knew that the crisis had arrived that would either shatter them completely or forge them into something strong enough to withstand whatever consequences followed from choosing love and authenticity over inherited power and social approval. Harrison left Eleanor's library that night with a clarity that felt both terrifying and liberating, the kind of certainty that arrives only when all other paths have been exhausted, and the soul recognizes its true direction regardless of cost, and he walked through London's darkening streets toward his father's residence, knowing that the conversation awaiting him would sever connections that stretched back through generations of Blackwell lineage, would transform him from heir to outcast in the span of a single confrontation, Yet he felt no hesitation because the months of standing vigil had taught him something. His father's brutal lessons never could that a life lived in service to inherited cruelty was no life at all, merely an expensive performance of empty power that corroded everything genuine within until nothing remained but the polished shell society mistook for strength. The confrontation with the old Duke unfolded in the mahogany-paneled study where Harrison had received so many punishments as a child, that familiar room where disappointment had been administered with methodical precision alongside the leather strap that hung even now in the corner like a monument to paternal authority. And Harrison spoke with a steadiness that surprised even himself, telling his father that he would not end his connection with Eleanor Hartwell, would not return to the cold performance of ducal duty as it had been defined for him since birth, that he chose instead to forfeit his inheritance and whatever financial security the Blackwell fortune represented, because he had discovered through painful transformation that integrity possessed a value that no amount of money could purchase or compensate for losing. The old Duke's rage erupted with volcanic force, threats and curses filling the study as he detailed exactly how he would destroy Harrison's prospects, strip him of access to family resources, ensure that every door in society closed against him, use his considerable influence to make certain that Harrison's choice resulted in complete social and financial ruin. Yet beneath the fury, Harrison detected something else, a father's baffled incomprehension that his carefully constructed heir had rejected the very power and position that generations of Blackwells had fought to accumulate and preserve. An almost wounded confusion that his son would choose an impoverished existence with a ruined woman over everything the family name could provide. Harrison left his father's house for the last time as midnight approached, carrying nothing but the clothes he wore and the books Eleanor had given him during their Thursday sessions, walking through rain that had begun to fall, like the city itself wept for the severing of family bonds, and he made his way to Eleanor's street where he had stood vigil so many nights before. But tonight he came not as the wealthy Duke performing penance, but as simply Harrison Blackwell, a man who had chosen love and authenticity over inherited privilege, who had nothing to offer except the changed heart he had fought so desperately to claim from the ruins of his upbringing. Eleanor watched from her window as she had so many nights, but she understood immediately that something fundamental had shifted in the man standing below, because his posture carried both defeat and victory simultaneously. The heavy sorrow of lost family, mixed with the strange lightness that comes from making an irrevocable choice aligned with one's deepest truth, and her heart broke and soared in the same moment as she comprehended what he had actually done, not merely contemplated, but completed the choice that would define the rest of both their lives. Harrison looked up at her window, where lamplight illuminated her silhouette, and called out with a voice that carried through the rain-soaked street, public enough that neighbors would certainly hear, yet intimate in its honest vulnerability, telling her that he came now with nothing but himself, no fortune or inheritance or anything except the man he had become through her patience and teaching, that he made no demands and held no expectations, but wanted her to know that she had been worth every consequence, that the peace he had found standing beneath her window these many months was worth more than all the Blackwell wealth and position combined. And Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she understood that Harrison had given her the rarest gift imaginable, not rescue or financial security or restoration of her social standing, but rather the demonstration through irrevocable action that his transformation had been genuine, that what they had built together possessed enough value that he would sacrifice everything else to preserve its integrity. And in that moment, she knew with devastating certainty that her own choice had become inevitable, that her heart had made its decision long ago, during those Thursday evenings in the library. She had only been waiting for proof that his courage matched the depth of feeling growing within her own chest, proof that now stood in the rain below her window, having burned every bridge except the one that led to her door. Harrison rose with the dawn after spending what remained of the night on Eleanor's doorstep, his body aching from the cold stone, and his heart both shattered and strangely whole, and he walked through London's awakening streets to the modest lodgings he had secured with the last of his personal funds, where he sat at a borrowed desk and began composing the most important letters of his life, not one letter but dozens, each addressed to a specific guest who had attended the Ashworth ball those many months ago. Each person who had witnessed his cruel mockery of Eleanor Hartwell and laughed or whispered or simply stood silent while he destroyed an innocent woman's dignity for sport. His hand cramped as he wrote through the morning and into the afternoon, but he pushed through the physical discomfort because these letters represented the final act of his transformation, the public accountability that would match the private change he had undergone through Eleanor's patient teaching and his own desperate efforts to become something better than the monster his upbringing had created. In each letter, he detailed with unflinching honesty the events of that terrible evening, describing his own cruelty not with excuse or mitigation, but with the stark clarity of someone who had come to understand the full weight of his actions, how he had targeted Eleanor precisely because her authenticity and intelligence threatened the carefully constructed facade he had worn like armor since childhood, how his mockery had been an act of cowardice rather than wit, the desperate lashing out of a man who saw in her everything he lacked and feared he could never possess. He wrote of the month since that night, of standing vigil outside her home, not seeking forgiveness but simply bearing witness to his own conscience, awakening after years of cruel slumber, and of the education she had offered him, not from pity, but from a generosity of spirit that he had done nothing to deserve, of the books and conversations and quiet evenings in her father's library, where he had discovered that poetry could move him to tears, and philosophy could reshape a soul, and genuine human connection could heal wounds he had believed permanent. Harrison described Eleanor's character with the kind of detail that only intimate knowledge provides. Her brilliant mind that ranged across subjects from classical literature to natural philosophy, her charitable work among London's poorest families that she conducted without seeking recognition or social credit, her devotion to her ailing father, and her quiet courage in facing a society that judged her for being different rather than celebrating her for being extraordinary. And he made clear that every judgment the Ton had passed upon her was not merely wrong, but revealed more about their own limited capacity for recognizing true quality than about any failing in Eleanor herself. The letters concluded with his public prostration, his acknowledgement that he had renounced his father's inheritance and whatever social position the Blackwell name had once commanded, and that he came before them now as simply a man who had committed a grievous wrong and spent months learning to become someone capable of recognizing and attempting to repair the damage he had caused. And he asked nothing from them except that they reconsider their judgment of Eleanor Hartwell, that they understand her reputation had been destroyed not through any fault of her own, but through his calculated cruelty, and if they possessed any justice or compassion, they would restore to her the social standing that he had stolen through his mockery. Harrison sealed the letters as evening fell and personally delivered them to every address, walking through Mayfair and Belgravia with packages of his own public humiliation, knowing that by morning all of London society would be reading his confession, that whatever remained of his reputation would be utterly destroyed in exchange for the possibility, not the certainty, but merely the chance that Eleanor's might be partially restored, and he accepted this exchange as both justice and gift, the symmetry of his own social death, purchasing her potential resurrection. And when the final letter had been delivered, he returned to Eleanor's street, where he took up his familiar position beneath her window, standing vigil now not just as penance but as prayer, hoping that she would understand what he had done and why, that she would recognize in this grand gesture the depth of feeling that had grown within him during their months of connection, the love that had transformed him from proud duke to humble supplicant, willing to sacrifice everything for the possibility of her happiness, even if that happiness ultimately excluded him entirely. Eleanor received the first whispers of Harrison's letters by mid-morning, when her maid brought tea along, with barely concealed excitement about rumors spreading through the servants' network that connected every great house in London, whispers that the Duke of Thornbury had done something unprecedented, something shocking, something that had the entire Ton buzzing with scandalized fascination. And by afternoon, 3 separate callers had arrived at her door not to see her, for she still refused most visitors, but to speak with her mother about the extraordinary letters that had arrived at dawn, letters that detailed with unflinching honesty the Duke's cruelty at the Ashworth ball and his subsequent transformation, letters that praised Eleanor's character with such intimate knowledge and genuine admiration that it was clear he had come to know her not as society saw her, but as she truly was, beneath all their shallow judgments. Eleanor's mother brought her one of the letters obtained from Lady Pemberton, who had been so moved by its contents that she insisted Eleanor's family see what Harrison had written, and Eleanor read with trembling hands the public confession of his cruelty, the detailed accounting of his months of penance and education, the passionate defense of her character that he had sent to every witness of her original humiliation, and as she read, she understood with crystalline clarity what he had done, had taken the weapon of public opinion that he had once wielded against her and turned it upon himself instead, and had transformed his own social standing into currency and spent it entirely to purchase even the possibility of restoring hers, had made himself the object of scandal and gossip and judgment so that she might be reconsidered, re-evaluated, perhaps even welcomed back into the society that had so readily condemned her based on his mockery alone. She sat in her father's library as the afternoon light faded to evening, holding that letter and feeling something shift within her chest, some final barrier crumbling under the weight of what Harrison had sacrificed not to win her affection, for he had asked nothing of her in his letters to society, but simply because justice demanded it, because he had come to understand, through their months of connection, that the damage he had inflicted required public repair, that private transformation was not enough when the wound had been delivered in front of witnesses who had carried the poison of his words throughout London's drawing rooms and ballrooms. Eleanor recognized the terrible symmetry of his gesture, how he had given her exactly what she had needed most, even before she knew she needed it. Not romantic declarations or material comfort, or even the promise of his continued devotion, but rather the restoration of her reputation through the deliberate destruction of his own, the public vindication that allowed her to hold her head high again, not because some powerful man had chosen to protect her, but because that same man had confessed his wrong and detailed her worth with such conviction that society would be forced to reconsider its hasty judgments, and in that recognition she felt her own choice crystallizing with the inevitability of water, finding its level, of seasons turning, of truth finally emerging after months of careful excavation. As midnight approached, Eleanor descended the stairs of her family's townhouse, her heart beating so loudly she was certain it echoed through the quiet halls, and she moved toward the front door, where she knew Harrison would be standing, as he had stood so many nights before. But tonight, when she reached for the handle, she did not pause to watch from behind curtains or hesitate to preserve some dignity or protection. Instead, she simply opened the door for the first time since that terrible ball, opening it while he stood there rather than waiting for him to leave at dawn, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw her standing in the doorway. Surprise and hope and fear and love all mingled together in a vulnerability that made him look nothing like the cruel Duke who had mocked her months ago, everything like the man who had fed stray cats at 3 in the morning and wept over Shakespeare's sonnets in her father's library. That expression told her everything she needed to know about whether his transformation had been genuine, whether his sacrifice had been calculated manipulation or honest restitution, and she found herself speaking words she had not planned, telling him to come inside, not to the servant's entrance this time, but through the front door like the guest. He had earned the right to be through months of patience and painful growth, and finally, through the grand gesture of public prostration that had restored to her the one thing his cruelty had stolen her place in the world, her right to be seen accurately rather than through the distorting lens of his mockery. Harrison stepped across the threshold into Eleanor's home with the careful reverence of a pilgrim entering a sacred space, and she led him not to the formal drawing room where they had conducted their educational sessions, but to the smaller, more intimate sitting room where firelight cast dancing shadows across walls lined with her father's books, and they sat facing each other in the quiet hours after midnight, while London slept outside, and the world contracted to just the two of them, and the truths that had been gathering weight throughout their months of connection, waiting for this moment, when all pretense could finally be stripped away and honesty could flow between them like water finding its natural course. Eleanor spoke first, her voice trembling but clear as she told him that she had fallen in love somewhere between his 50th vigil and his 100th, that she could not pinpoint the exact moment when anger had transformed into fascination, and fascination into affection, and affection into something deeper and more terrifying than she had ever imagined possible, and she confessed that she loved not the Duke of Thornbury, who had mocked her at the Ashworth ball, not the powerful aristocrat, who commanded society's respect through fear and position, but rather the man who stood in rain and snow reading poetry by lamplight, the man who wept over Shakespeare's sonnets and fed stray cats and helped drunk men find their way home in the darkest hours of night, the man who had learned to see beauty in ordinary moments because she had taught him how, and who had taught her in return that transformation was possible, even for those who seemed most thoroughly corrupted by pride and cruelty. Harrison listened with tears streaming down his face, and when she finished speaking, he reached for her hands with a gentleness that would have been unimaginable from the man he had been months ago. And he told her that he had loved her since the third night of his vigil, when he had watched from his post as she emerged from her house at dawn to give bread and coins to a street child who was crying from hunger, how that single act of unobserved kindness had cracked something open inside him that he had thought sealed permanently shut, how he had returned night after night, not just from guilt or penance, but because those hours standing beneath her window became the most peaceful moments of his entire life. The only time when the constant noise of his father's voice telling him he was worthless unless he dominated others, the perpetual anxiety of maintaining his cruel facade, the exhausting performance of being the duke society expected, all of it fell away, and he could simply exist in the presence of someone genuinely good, someone whose worth did not depend on crushing others to elevate herself, someone who showed him through her very existence that there was another way to move through the world. They talked through the night as the fire burned low and then died to embers, sharing stories from their childhoods and confessing fears they had never spoken aloud. And Eleanor told him about the years of feeling like she did not fit anywhere, how her love of books and learning had made her strange in a society that valued only beauty and wit and proper comportment, how his mockery at the ball had confirmed every terrible thing she had ever believed about herself, that she was too much and not enough simultaneously, that her authentic self was something to be hidden rather than celebrated, that she would never find someone who could love her not despite her differences, but because of them. Harrison shared memories he had buried so deeply, he had almost convinced himself they were not real, how his father had beaten him whenever he showed softness or compassion, how he had learned to hide every tender impulse behind layers of cruelty and arrogance, how the man he had become was not his true self, but rather a survival mechanism that had gradually consumed the frightened boy who once cried over injured birds and dreamed of being kind. And he confessed that meeting Eleanor, being educated by her in literature and philosophy and basic human decency, had been like remembering a language he had been forced to forget, like coming home to himself after years of exile in a foreign land where nothing made sense and everything hurt. They both cried and they both laughed, sometimes simultaneously, as the vulnerability between them deepened into something that felt more intimate than any physical touch. And as dawn began to lighten the sky outside, Eleanor found herself thinking that this moment, this honest exchange of broken places and careful hopes, was worth every tear she had shed at the Ashworth ball, every lonely day of her retreat, every complicated feeling of watching him stand vigil, while not knowing whether to trust the transformation she was witnessing, because all of it had led to this, to sitting across from a man who had traveled from cruelty to compassion through the difficult terrain of genuine change, a man who loved her not for conforming to society's expectations, but for being exactly who she was, a man who had proven through months of patient action and finally through public self-sacrifice that his love was real and his remorse was genuine and his transformation was complete. Their courtship unfolded in ways that scandalized London society while liberating them, both from the suffocating expectations that had shaped their lives, until that transformative night of confession and reconciliation, for Harrison and Eleanor chose to court not in drawing rooms under the watchful eyes of chaperones or at carefully orchestrated social events designed to display eligibility and propriety, but rather in the streets of London's poorest districts where they walked side by side, distributing food and coins to families who struggled to survive, visiting workhouses where Eleanor had long conducted her charitable work, but which Harrison had never entered until she showed him the faces behind the statistics he had once discussed with casual indifference over brandy in gentlemen's clubs, and together they attended public lectures on philosophy and science at institutions that welcomed women as students rather than ornaments, sitting in crowded halls where ideas mattered more than lineage, and Eleanor's brilliant questions were celebrated rather than suppressed. Society watched with horrified fascination as the Duke of Thornbury, now stripped of his father's fortune, but still carrying the title that meant nothing without wealth to support its dignity, courted the eccentric Lady Eleanor in full view of anyone who cared to observe, making no attempt to hide their unconventional connection or soften the scandal of a ruined duke, pursuing a woman whose reputation he himself had damaged, and the gossip spread through drawing rooms like wildfire, with some matrons declaring it the most romantic transformation they had witnessed, while others insisted it was merely proof that both Harrison and Eleanor were unsuitable for polite society and deserved each other in their mutual disgrace. Harrison's sister Arabella became Eleanor's closest friend during these months of courtship, for she had been the one who first confronted Harrison about his cruelty and had watched his transformation with growing hope that her beloved brother might finally escape their father's poisonous influence. And she stood beside Eleanor at social functions that Eleanor tentatively began to attend again, creating a small but fierce circle of supporters who had witnessed Harrison's genuine change and recognized in Eleanor the extraordinary woman who had catalyzed it. And Arabella confessed to Eleanor during one of their long afternoon teas that she had spent years watching Harrison become more cruel and distant under their father's training, had mourned the kind boy he had once been, and seeing him laugh freely again, seeing him moved to tears by poetry and motivated by compassion rather than contempt, felt like witnessing a resurrection of someone she thought lost forever. The few who supported their courtship were themselves the genuine and kind souls who valued substance over appearance, who recognized that Harrison's public confession and Eleanor's willingness to forgive represented something rare and precious in a society built on maintaining facades and hiding vulnerability. And these supporters, a handful of reform-minded lords, several blue-stocking ladies who had long championed women's education, a few compassionate clergy who preached redemption rather than condemnation, formed a small community around Harrison and Eleanor that proved more sustaining than the broad but shallow approval of the ton had ever been. Eleanor discovered during their unconventional courtship that freedom from society's expectations brought its own kind of joy, that walking through markets with Harrison to select books for the small lending library they were establishing for working families felt more meaningful than any ball she had attended, in that discussing philosophy with him over simple meals in modest restaurants, while other diners stared with recognition and curiosity, satisfied her soul more deeply than elegant dinners, where conversation never ventured beyond weather and gossip. And she found herself thinking that Harrison's cruelty at the Ashworth ball, as devastating as it had been, had paradoxically freed them. Both had forced them outside the rigid structures that would have kept them separate and miserable, had created the conditions for genuine transformation that would have been impossible if he had courted her conventionally, or if she had remained safely ensconced in society's limited vision of what women should be and want. Harrison chose the midnight hour for his proposal because it held sacred meaning for them both, the time when he had stood vigil beneath her window through rain and snow and frost, the hours when transformation had taken root in frozen ground and grown, despite all odds, into something neither had dared imagine possible. And so on, a clear November night, when stars pierced the darkness above London and the air carried the first whisper of winter's approach, he stood once more at Eleanor's door, not as a penitent seeking forgiveness, but as a man who had found himself through the patient guidance of the woman he loved. And when Eleanor opened the door at his gentle knock, she found him there without the trappings of wealth or position, without the armor of arrogance that had once defined him, just Harrison in simple clothes with eyes that held both vulnerability and certainty. And he took her hands in his with the careful reverence that characterized all his gestures toward her now, and told her that he wished to ask her something in this place where his old self had died and his true self had been born, where cruelty had been transformed into compassion through the alchemy of her grace and his willingness to endure whatever penance was required. He spoke without the polished eloquence expected of aristocratic proposals, without grand declarations or practiced phrases, but rather with the halting honesty of a man offering his genuine heart, and he told her that he had nothing to give her in material terms, no grand estates or family jewels or social position that could elevate her standing, for his father had made good on his threats, and Harrison possessed now only his title without the fortune that had sustained it for generations. But he offered her instead something he believed far more valuable, a heart that had learned to love authentically rather than possess strategically, a mind that had been open to beauty and compassion through her patient teaching, a soul that had been remade in the image of the values she embodied, and a commitment to spend every remaining day of his life standing beside her, not in the metaphorical sense of marriage vows, but in the literal sense of partnership, supporting her work and sharing her dreams and building together a life that mattered beyond the shallow concerns of society. Eleanor listened with tears gathering in her eyes as Harrison knelt on the same stones where he had stood through countless vigils, and he asked her formally and simply if she would consent to be his wife, to accept this changed man with all his remaining flaws and continuing growth, to trust that the transformation she had witnessed was permanent and true, to believe that he would spend their years together proving himself worthy of the extraordinary gift of her love. And before he finished speaking, Eleanor was pulling him to his feet and saying yes, through tears and laughter simultaneously, telling him that he misunderstood what he was offering because what he described authenticity and growth, genuine love, was not nothing but rather everything she had ever wanted, more valuable than all the estates and jewels in England, more precious than the approval of a society that had never understood her anyway. They stood together in the midnight hour outside her door with London sleeping around them and the stars bearing witness above, and Harrison slipped onto her finger a simple ring he had commissioned with the last of his personal funds, a band of gold engraved with words from one of the sonnets they had read together during their educational sessions, and Eleanor looked at this ring that represented sacrifice rather than excess, meaning rather than display, and she thought that it was perfect, precisely because it symbolized who they had become to each other, two people who had found in their shared brokenness the possibility of wholeness, who had discovered that love built on genuine transformation and mutual growth was stronger than anything constructed on the unstable foundation of social expectation or material wealth. They sealed their engagement not with a chaste kiss appropriate for public view, but with an embrace that held all the passion and tenderness and relief of two souls who had found each other against impossible odds, who had survived the fire of public scandal and private doubt to emerge, transformed and bound together. And as they held each other in the place where grace had first begun its quiet work, Eleanor whispered that she loved him not despite the man he had been, but because of the courage it took to become someone new. And Harrison answered that she had saved his life in every way a person could be saved, and they both knew that this proposal, offered and accepted at midnight outside her door, was not an ending, but rather a beginning of the life they would build together, in defiance of every expectation and in celebration of every hard-won truth they had learned. Their wedding took place on a mild spring morning in a small chapel far from the grand cathedrals, where society marriages were typically celebrated, attended only by those whose love for Harrison and Eleanor transcended scandal and whose presence represented genuine affection rather than social obligation. Arabella stood as Eleanor's witness with tears of joy streaming down her face. A handful of reform-minded friends who had supported their unconventional courtship filled the simple pews, and Eleanor's father, though weakened by illness, walked his daughter down the short aisle with pride radiating from his worn features, and Harrison waited at the altar in clothes that were fine but not ostentatious, his face transformed by a smile of such unguarded happiness that even the skeptical clergyman found himself moved by the obvious depth of feeling between this unlikely pair. The ceremony itself was brief and meaningful, stripped of the elaborate pageantry that characterized aristocratic weddings, with vows that Harrison and Eleanor had written themselves, speaking of partnership and growth and the sacred duty to help each other become better versions of themselves with each passing year. And when the clergyman pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison kissed Eleanor with tender reverence, while the small gathering applauded, and she thought that this moment, in this humble chapel, with these few genuine souls as witnesses, was worth more than any grand wedding in Westminster Abbey, attended by hundreds who cared only for spectacle and status. The years that followed their wedding unfolded like chapters in a book neither had dared to imagine writing, as they established a life built not on the foundation of inherited wealth and social position, but rather on shared values and purposeful work that gave meaning to their days. They took Harrison's remaining resources and Eleanor's modest inheritance and combined them with funds raised from their small circle of supporters to establish schools in London's poorest districts, Modest buildings, where children who would otherwise have had no access to education could learn to read and write and calculate, and could be exposed to literature and philosophy and science, regardless of their parents' ability to pay, and Eleanor taught there herself 3 days each week, while Harrison managed the practical aspects of running the institutions and fundraising for their expansion. And together they created something that would outlive them, both a legacy of opportunity extended to those whom society had deemed unworthy of investment. Harrison never stopped reading poetry, and their home gradually filled with books that represented not wealth displayed but wisdom actively pursued. Volumes that showed signs of being read and reread, pages marked with notes in Harrison's careful handwriting as he continued the education that Eleanor had begun during their weekly sessions in her father's library. And sometimes in the evenings he would read aloud to her while she worked on lesson plans for her students, his voice carrying the emotion of verses in ways that still moved them both to tears, and Eleanor would pause in her work to listen and marvel that this man who spoke Shakespeare's sonnets with such feeling was the same person who had once valued only cruelty and superiority. Eleanor never stopped teaching, finding in the work not merely occupation but vocation, a calling that satisfied the brilliant mind that society had tried to suppress and channeled her natural compassion into practical assistance for those who needed it most, and her students adored her for the patience and genuine interest she showed in their progress. And many would later speak of Lady Eleanor Blackwell as the person who changed the trajectory of their lives by believing they were capable of learning and achieving despite the circumstances of their birth. They were happy in ways that neither had known possible before their transformation, a happiness built not on the shallow pleasures of social triumph or material accumulation, but rather on the deep satisfaction of shared purpose and mutual growth. On quiet evenings discussing ideas that mattered, and mornings waking beside someone who knew them fully and loved them not, despite their flaws, but as complete human beings, and their friends remarked that Harrison and Eleanor seemed to grow more devoted with each passing year, rather than settling into the comfortable indifference that characterized so many long marriages. Sometimes, on quiet nights when London slept and stars emerged between the coal smoke that perpetually hung over the city, Harrison would step outside their modest home and stand for a few moments in the place that roughly corresponded to where he had kept his vigil years before, and Eleanor would watch from the window, as she once had, but now she would smile and wrap a shawl around her shoulders and join him outside, and he would take her hand and tell her that he stood there sometimes just to remember where Grace had found him, and to honor the place where his old self had frozen to death so his true self could be born. And Eleanor would rest her head against his shoulder and reply that she too needed to remember, to hold in her heart the knowledge that the worst moment of her life had become the doorway to the best, that humiliation had led to transformation, and that cruelty, when met with the possibility of redemption, could birth the most extraordinary love. Dear listener, as we close the chapter on Harrison and Eleanor's story, let us pause together to consider what their journey reveals about the nature of transformation and the surprising pathways that lead us from our darkest moments toward unexpected light. For theirs was not a tale of easy redemption or simple forgiveness, but rather a testament to the profound truth that our worst actions need not define us permanently if we possess the courage to stand in the cold rain of our consequences and endure whatever penance is required to become someone new. Harrison's cruelty at the Ashworth ball was real and devastating. His words cut deep and caused genuine harm, yet that moment of terrible weakness became paradoxically the catalyst for his becoming the man he was always meant to be, stripped of the false armor of arrogance and superiority that his upbringing had welded to his soul. And is this not true for so many of us, that our moments of greatest shame can become the doorways through which grace enters if we do not run from what we have done, but rather stand vigil with our regret until it transforms us? Eleanor's humiliation was complete and public. Her pain was witnessed by hundreds and whispered about by thousands, yet she found within herself the extraordinary strength to extend to her tormentor, not easy forgiveness but rather something far more valuable, the opportunity to prove through sustained action that his remorse was genuine, that his transformation was real. And in doing so, she discovered that the scholarly awkward woman society had dismissed possessed reserves of wisdom and compassion that would eventually change not only Harrison's life, but the lives of countless children who would attend the schools born from their shared purpose. Consider how Harrison's vigil was not a grand gesture designed to win approval, but rather the quiet, persistent work of a man willing to stand in discomfort night after night, with no guarantee of forgiveness, seeking not to erase what he had done, but to demonstrate through patient endurance that he understood the gravity of his cruelty and was willing to bear whatever weight was required to prove his change was authentic. And is this not the nature of true transformation, in that it cannot be rushed or performed for an audience, but must be lived through in the lonely hours when no one is watching, except perhaps one person at a window who is learning slowly to see past the surface to the struggling soul beneath? Their love story teaches us that redemption is always possible but never easy, that the path from cruelty to compassion requires walking through fire and standing in storms, that becoming someone new means letting the old self freeze to death in the midnight cold so that something truer can be born, and that this process cannot be hurried or shortcutted, but must be endured with patience and faith that growth is happening even when we cannot see it, like seeds germinating in frozen ground that will eventually push through into spring light. So if you find yourself standing in the cold rain of your own consequences, if you carry the weight of words spoken in anger or actions taken in ignorance, if you have caused harm and wish desperately that you could become someone different, know that transformation is within your reach, but it requires Harrison's courage to stand vigil with your regret, Eleanor's wisdom to extend opportunity for proven change rather than empty words, and the patience to understand that becoming new is the work of countless small moments accumulated over time until they build into a life you never imagined possible. May you find the strength to endure your own necessary vigils. May you discover companions willing to help you become better than you were. May you build lives of meaning and purpose from the ruins of your worst moments. And may you rest peacefully tonight, knowing that redemption is not granted, but earned through the patient, persistent work of standing in the rain until you are transformed. This story comes to you from Romantically Inclined, where we believe in the possibility of transformation and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. And if this tale has moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear that their worst moment need not be their defining one, and may peace find you wherever you are on your own journey toward becoming.